In our last lecture, we examined the works of Samuel Richardson and Henry Fielding, two early masters of the English novel. And in this lecture, we'll turn our attention to a later generation of writers, moving from the middle of the 18th century all the way down to the end of it. Let's start in 1750. At that point, critics like Samuel Johnson, who was born in 1709 and died in 1784, an important mid-century figure, reviewing the works of Richardson and Fielding, agreed that a new literary form was emerging. These critics did not agree on what to call the new form. As I mentioned earlier, the terminology was still relatively unstable. But the critics did believe that it could be distinguished from earlier kinds of fiction by its commitment to realism. They also thought that the new form was especially popular. They noticed that it was especially popular with young women, and the potential that it might prove harmful to such readers was often cause for worry. Now let's take a look at a passage from one of Johnson's essays in which he expresses such concerns. As you'll see, his chief worry is that impressionable readers will be moved to imitate the behavior they see represented in novels. These books, Johnson says, are written chiefly to the young, the ignorant, and the idle. So it's not just that readers are young, and it's not even that they're ignorant. They're young, ignorant, and idle. These books are written chiefly to the young, the ignorant, and the idle, to whom they serve as lectures of conduct and introductions into life. They are the entertainment of minds unfurnished with ideas and therefore easily susceptible of impressions, not fixed by principles and therefore easily following the current of fancy, not informed by experience, you gotta love these periodic sentences, and consequently open to every false suggestion and partial account. Now, as we listen to this sort of argument, it's easy for us to brush it off. But similar arguments are still common today, especially in discussions of television violence, video games, and rap music. We still worry about the possibility that young people will imitate the bad behavior they see in the media. In thinking about the development of the English novel tradition, we will want to keep these arguments in mind. For even the greatest English critics of the 18th and 19th centuries, and Johnson is surely among them, moral considerations are an essential part of literary evaluation, and that's a point worth noting. In the 20th century, we were often encouraged to separate morality from literature. That separation would have been remarkable to critics like Johnson. They never would have accepted it. To those critics, the two things were intimately related. Now, here's how Johnson deals with the question of how virtue and vice should be represented in novelistic fiction. In narratives where historical veracity has no place, in other words, where we're not worried about accurately representing the events of the past, I cannot discover why there should not be exhibited the most perfect idea of virtue. Of virtue not angelical, nor above probability, for what we cannot credit we shall never imitate, but the highest and purest that humanity can reach. Vice, for vice is necessary to show, should always disgust. Whenever it appears, it should raise hatred by the malignity of its practices and contempt by the meanness of its stratagems. For while it is supported by either parts or spirit, it will seldom be heartily abhorred. For Johnson and many other critics writing in the decades following the rise of the novel, two things are clear. Virtue must always be sharply distinguished from vice. You have to be able to tell the good guys from the bad guys. And virtue must inspire admiration on the part of the reader, vice disgust. Now, these ideas provide a backdrop for the work of writers like Laurence Sterne, Frances Burney, and Ann Radcliffe. In considering these writers, we will have a chance to bridge the gap between early novelists like Richardson and Fielding and later ones like Sir Walter Scott and Jane Austen. We will also begin to see the period from 1750 to 1800 as one dominated by different kinds of experimentation. Sterne, Burney, and Radcliffe are all strikingly different. with each suggesting new possibilities for the development of the novel form. Let's start with Laurence Sterne, who's born in 1713 and dies in 1768. Sterne is one of the strangest and most contradictory figures in the history of the English novel. He's born in Ireland, where his father is serving in the military, and he eventually enters the church. Yet even as he continues preaching, he publishes a work noted then and now for its extraordinary bawdiness. One of my teachers in graduate school liked to describe this work, Tristram Shandy, as a tissue of filth, and he was quite right. In this astonishing and hilarious novel, which appeared from 1759 to 1767, Sterne considers the limitations of novelistic realism. The novel is a fictional memoir, and Tristram's stated intention is to, quote, do exact justice to his own life and opinions. Almost from the start, Tristram finds this task to be impossible, since he can't help getting sidetracked or falling into digressions. Tristram starts his story at the very beginning, the moment of his conception, with a comic sex scene involving his parents. Before long, however, he has gotten sidetracked. He finds that he can't tell us about his birth without first telling us about the midwife who delivered him. He then finds that he can't tell us about her without first telling us how she entered the profession, and then finds that he can't tell us about that without first telling us about a horse belonging to one of the people who first encouraged her. I'm not making any of this up. Now, eventually, Tristram cuts himself off and reflects on his own predicament. And here's what he says. When a man sits down to write a history, though it be but the history of Jack Hickathrift or Tom Thumb, any old person, he knows no more than his heels what lets and confounded hindrances he is to meet with in his way, or what a dance he may be led by one excursion or another before all is over. Now, what he's saying there, basically, is simple. Don't blame me. I can't help it. If you want to write a history, and if you want that history to be accurate, you will have to accept the fact that you're not really in control of your own work. What's more, you'll want to consider the possibility that being in control isn't all it's cracked up to be. Now, here's how he makes that point, comparing the writer or historiographer to a mule driver. And this is an unflattering comparison, right? The writer is usually an elevated and esteemed figure. Mule driver, not so much. Could a historiographer drive on his history as a muleteer drives on his mule, straightforward, for instance, from Rome all the way to Loreto, without ever once turning his head aside either to the right hand or to the left? He might venture to foretell you to an hour when he should get to his journey's end. But the thing is, morally speaking, impossible. For if he is a man of the least spirit, and this is key, Tristram suggests that you really wouldn't want to be the kind of person who doesn't get sidetracked. If a man is of the least spirit, he will have 50 deviations from a straight line to make with this or that party as he goes along, which he can no ways avoid. He will have views and prospects to himself perpetually soliciting his eye, which he can no more help standing still to look at than he can fly. He will moreover have various accounts to reconcile, anecdotes to pick up, inscriptions to make out, stories to weave in, traditions to sift. Now, if it's seeming like this list could go on forever, you're beginning to get the hang of Tristram Shandy. Personages to call upon, panegyrics to paste up at this door, pasquinades at that. All which both the man and his mule are quite exempt from. To sum up all, there are archives at every stage to be looked into, and rolls, records, documents, and endless genealogies, which justice ever and anon calls him back to stay the reading of. In short, there is no end of it. These digressions do make Tristram's narrative appear chaotic. The book is notoriously difficult to follow. But without those digressions, Sterne suggests, the story would be incomplete and misleading. Thus, Sterne reveals both the costs and the benefits of conventional forms of narration, suggesting that the effect of realism the appearance of realism, which writers like Richardson and Fielding had worked so hard to create, the effect of realism is created largely through omissions and distortions. Even as Sterne makes us question the idea of realism, he also offers a vivid image of life's complexity and absurdity. And in its own very strange way, Tristram Shandy may be even more realistic than the work of either Richardson or Fielding. Let's just think about that for a moment. What would it really be like to write down everything that happened to you today? Every single thing that happened, every single thing that passed through your mind. It would be incredibly difficult. It would be incredibly complicated. All of the thoughts you've had, even as I've been making this point, how could you possibly record them? So if you're going to keep a record of what happened to you today, you're probably going to have to omit a few things. And how will you decide what to omit? What principles will you use in making those decisions? Once you start thinking about those issues, once you start asking those questions, you can see that Sterne's take on realism is a very profound and interesting one, and maybe more philosophically sophisticated than other approaches to that issue. Before moving on, we should note that Sterne's paradoxical approach to storytelling not only had an enormous impact on his contemporaries, but also influenced the work of later writers, from Italo Calvino to Kurt Vonnegut and David Foster Wallace. The second writer to be examined in this lecture is Frances Burney. Her dates are 1752 to 1840, so she makes it well into the 19th century. Burney's father was himself a man of letters. He was the close friend of Samuel Johnson, the critic I quoted at the beginning of this lecture, and he was also the author of a 4-volume history of music, the first such work to appear in England. So Frances grew up in the midst of literary society. She lost her mother while still a young girl and published her first novel, Evelina, while still in her mid-20s. In Evelina, which appeared in 1778, Burney tells the story of a young woman who is leaving home and moving into society for the first time. This novel, like Richardson's Pamela, is chiefly concerned with issues of courtship and marriage. It's described quite often as a female Bildungsroman. The Bildungsroman is just a sort of literary critical term that we use to describe novels of education or development. Now, throughout this novel, Evelina is often plagued by unwelcome advances and surrounded by unworthy suitors. She can't get away from these guys. Nevertheless, her story ends happily with her marriage to a nobleman. Near the end of the novel, as a kind of prelude to the marriage, Evelina is also reunited with her estranged father, who turns out to be a nobleman. So the ending of this book is a little bit like the ending of Tom Jones, in that Evelina's origins are discovered and are found to be quite excellent. Now, in working out its comedic ending, the novel not only explores the experiences of young women, but also exploits the fears and fantasies of the middle class. During the course of the novel, Evelina makes 2 visits to London, where she is repeatedly embarrassed by her ill-mannered relatives. In this passage, she relates a mortifying experience with her uncle, aunt, and cousins. And I should just explain that the uncle is a shopkeeper. He's in trade, and his manners are very, very crude. Unfortunately, he and his family, they're all very pretentious. So they decide that when Evelina comes to town, they'll take her to the opera. She really wants to go. So they go to the opera, and it turns out that although Evelina's relatives have passed themselves off as experienced and sophisticated city folk, they have no idea of how to behave at the opera house. Indeed, they can't even figure out how to get in the building. Here's the quotation. It comes from Evelina herself. This is a novel told in letters, kind of like Richardson's Pamela. Here's what she says. If I had not been too much chagrined to laugh, so she admits that to someone else it might seem funny, I should have been extremely diverted at their ignorance of whatever belongs to an opera. In the first place, they could not tell at what door we ought to enter, and we wandered about for some time without knowing which way to turn. They did not choose to apply to me, though I was the only person of the party who had ever before been in an opera, because they were unwilling to suppose that their country cousin, as they were pleased to call me, should be better acquainted with any London public place than themselves. And here you might just imagine what this would be like. You go to visit your cousins in the big city. You get them to take you to a Broadway show. You arrive at the theater, and it turns out that they can't tell the box office from the stage door. They don't even know how to get into the place. And you're mortified. You're humiliated. And also, to some extent, amused. Now, if all of that weren't bad enough, it turns out that the performance is also being attended by another character, Sir Clement Willoughby, a nobleman with whom Evelina is acquainted. Naturally, she fears that he will see her with her relatives and conclude that she's as foolish as they are. And here we have a kind of early version of the kind of embarrassment, the sort of embarrassment that middle-class children still feel when they're with their parents at the mall or the movies or at school or wherever. Like, mom's wearing that, dad's saying this. This is so embarrassing. I hope no one can tell that I'm with them. Anyway, here's Evelina. I perceived standing near the gallery door Sir Clement Willoughby. I was extremely vexed and would have given the world to have avoided being seen by him. My chief objection was from the apprehension that he would hear Miss Branton, that's one of Evelina's cousins, call me cousin. I fear he will think this London journey has made me grow very proud, but indeed this family is so low-bred and vulgar that I should be equally ashamed of such a connection in the country or anywhere. Sir Clement is not a very nice guy, as it turns out, but that hardly matters, for although Evelina shouldn't desire his approval and admiration, she wants it anyway. She wants to show that she's better than her boorish family, to show that though born into the middle class, she actually belongs with finer, more sophisticated, and wealthier sorts of people. So here we see, and I really want to be serious about this point, a kind of typical or characteristic middle-class anxiety. We want the approval of people who outrank us, and yet we're suspicious at the same time of systems of ranking, and a little embarrassed at our, continuing attachment to them. Burney's novels were very popular. 18 editions of Evelina were published in her lifetime. She published the novel anonymously. It's interesting to note that she didn't even tell her father that she was engaged in this literary work. He didn't find out until after the novel appeared, and he was delighted that his daughter had done so well, which makes a happy ending to that story. Burney also became an important literary influence on Jane Austen. We often think of Austen as the first great woman writer in the English tradition. She's often presented to us in that way, but in fact she is preceded by a number of other women writers, and Burney was one of her favorites. To establish the importance of Burney to Austen, I'll just note that the title of Pride and Prejudice was suggested by a scene in one of Burney's books. So we know that Austen read and admired Burney. The third and final author to be examined in this lecture is Ann Radcliffe, and her dates are 1764 to 1823. Now notice that we are indeed moving on to another generation. Pamela, Richardson's Pamela, the novel often identified as the first novel in the English tradition, comes out in 1740. Radcliffe is born in 64, 24 years later, so a full generation later. She's another middle-class person, but her father is in trade. He managed a showroom for the Wedgwood pottery firm, and she grew up amidst much wealthier relatives. One of her playmates actually was the grandmother of Charles Darwin, the famous scientist. She began writing fiction shortly after getting married, supposedly to occupy herself while her husband, a journalist, was away on business. He encouraged her, and she eventually became the most popular and influential of the Gothic novelists who rose to fame near the end of the 18th century. Now, the Gothic tradition is an enormously important one, and I'll say more about it later, For now, I want to make it clear that Radcliffe did not invent the Gothic novel. Credit for that goes to a man named Horace Walpole, who was actually the son of the famous 18th century Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole. And his book, called The Castle of Otranto, is generally considered the first work in this Gothic tradition. Radcliffe takes up that tradition, though, and makes a wonder out of it, turns herself into a literary phenomenon. In her most popular novel, The Mysteries of Udolpho, which appeared in 1794, Radcliffe dramatizes the experience of psychological conflict and trauma. Like many authors of Gothic fiction, Radcliffe places her characters and readers in unsettling situations, appearing to depart from the conventions of novelistic realism. Instead of setting her story in an English town or village, she takes us to France and Italy, countries that many of her English readers still associated with medieval superstition. Similarly, instead of focusing on contemporary life, Radcliffe and her characters seem to be preoccupied with the secrets of the past. In Gothic novels, it's often said, the past seems to have a kind of stranglehold on the present. We can't really figure out what we want to do in the present until we resolve these mysteries and confusions about the past. Now, as Radcliffe moves out of England and into the past, she takes her readers into something like a dream world, exposing her heroines to extreme forms of emotional and psychological distress. In Radcliffe's world, the heroine is given a chance to indulge her suspicions and fears. In this passage, for example, the heroine of the Mysteries of Udolpho, Emily, encounters for the first time the medieval castle in which she's being taken to live. Emily gazed with melancholy awe upon the castle, for though it was now lighted up by the setting sun, the Gothic greatness of its features and its moldering walls of dark gray stone rendered it a gloomy and sublime object. Now let's just stop there to consider the importance of the word sublime. The word sublime is of great importance to the Romantic poets of this period, and it is often used to describe glaciers and mountains, anything that seems both fascinating and terrifying or imposing. So please keep that point in mind as we work through the rest of the passage, because the word sublime will appear again. And notice, too, that although the castle is gloomy, it's not just that. There's something compelling and even beautiful about it as well. So let's resume the quotation. As she gazed, the light died away on its walls, leaving a melancholy purple tint, which spread deeper and deeper as the thin vapor crept up the mountain, while the battlements above were still tipped with splendor. From those, too, the rays soon faded, and the whole edifice was invested with the solemn duskiness of evening. Silent, lonely, and sublime, and there's that word again, it seemed to stand the sovereign of the scene and to frown defiance on all who dared to invade its solitary reign. It's as if the castle is a character resisting the invasion of people like Emily. As the twilight deepened then, its features became more awful in obscurity, and Emily continued to gaze, till its clustering towers were alone seen, rising over the tops of the woods, beneath whose thick shade the carriages soon after began to ascend. The extent and darkness of these tall woods awakened terrific images in her mind. And here we're moving on to a new paragraph, and we need to notice that the narrator is no longer talking about the castle itself, or even the play of light and shadows on the surface of the castle, but rather about the images that the castle evokes or conjures in Emily's mind. Let's back up. The extent and darkness of these tall woods awakened terrific images in her mind, and she almost expected to see banditti, that's the Italian word for bandits, right, start up from under the trees. At length, the carriages emerged upon a heathy rock, and soon after reached the castle gates, where the deep tone of the portal bell, which was struck upon to give notice of their arrival, increased the fearful emotions that had assailed Emily. Now notice here that her emotions are figured as a kind of assailant. It's like your emotions are sneaking up on you and beating up on you. That's how she feels at this point. While they waited till the servant within should come to open the gates, she anxiously surveyed the edifice. But the gloom that overspread it allowed her to distinguish little more than a part of its outline, with the massy walls of the ramparts, and to know that it was vast, ancient, and dreary. Over the course of the story, as secrets are uncovered and mysteries resolved, the past eventually loses its hold on the present. Emily gains a kind of freedom, and something like sanity and order is restored. Each of the work's most mysterious and troubling events is also shown to have a reasonable explanation. And this is one of the things that really distinguishes Radcliffe from some other writers in the Gothic tradition. She ultimately provides a kind of rational explanation for all of the mysterious phenomena that she presents in the course of the work. And a really sort of humble and maybe even silly example of how this works today would be any old episode of Scooby-Doo, right? Because at the end of these cartoons, we find out that the ghost is really the old caretaker who's got a grudge against the landlord, right? The same sort of thing happens, obviously not in such a silly way, in Radcliffe. In the Mysteries of Udolpho, Emily is eventually freed to marry her sweetheart, a Venetian nobleman, and to take her rightful place in society. Thus, although Radcliffe seems to abandon the conventions of the novel, and this is a really important point, although she appears to abandon the conventions of the novel, with its emphasis on realism, those conventions are actually reaffirmed and reinforced at the end of the Mysteries of Udolpho. We re-enter a kind of novelistic world, and the reality and solidity of that world is reaffirmed for us. Like Sterne and Burney, Radcliffe has had an enormous influence on later writers, and I'm not just talking about the guys at Hanna-Barbera. Her most obvious influence is on the tradition of Gothic fiction, which includes writers from Mary Shelley. Frankenstein has a number of Gothic elements. The Brontës sisters probably deserve to be mentioned here. Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, a number of Gothic elements. And we can go all the way through the 18th century down to a figure like Stephen King. The hotel in The Shining is a little bit like the castle of Otranto. It has all of these mysterious passageways. Clearly something happened there, and we need to figure out what that was before we can get on with our own lives in the present. In her concern with the relationship between past and present, and her negotiation of the boundaries between the romance and the novel, Ann Radcliffe also helps to inspire the historical fiction of Sir Walter Scott. So to wrap this up, I'll just say that the legacies of these three writers, though obviously very different, attest to the vitality of the decades following 1750. In these decades, basic assumptions about the novel and its differences from other forms were indeed beginning to take shape. It's clear that we aren't dealing with romances and amatory tales anymore. At the same time, the novel form itself remained highly unstable, and instead of a single dominant approach to storytelling, the period gives rise to a number of competing possibilities. And I just have to say, as I close, that this period is, in my view, and I think in the view of many other scholars, kind of understudied. So if you're interested in doing further work in literature at the college level or even in graduate school, look at this period from 1750 to 1800 because there's a lot of wonderful stuff there. All right, in our next lecture, we'll move from Radcliffe in the 1790s to Sir Walter Scott in the 18-teens, considering Scott's enormously important contribution to the development of the historical novel.